The relationship between Russia and China is being put to the test. The two nuclear neighbors, although having different political and economic interests, have one common goal: to counter the US and its allies. And that was on full display early last month when the presidents of Russia and China stood side by side in Beijing, pledging to support each other against American policies. But how far will this partnership go, especially with a conflict raging across Ukraine? Since Russia's attack began 2 weeks ago, China has been offering public support to Moscow. China's foreign minister on Monday called Russia its chief strategic partner and pointed blame at the US for fueling tensions both in Europe and in the Asia-Pacific. But that show of support hasn't translated into tough, real diplomatic actions. China still has not recognized Russia's annexation of Crimea or the independence of two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine. Beijing also abstained from a UN vote that condemned Russia's attack. China has publicly supported Ukraine's territorial integrity and called for a peaceful solution to the conflict. So how far is China willing to go to risk its own economy to prop up an increasingly isolated Russia? And joining me now to discuss this from Singapore is Raffaello Pantucci. He is a senior associate fellow at Royal United Services Institute, a defense and security think tank, and Owen Greene, a professor of international security and development at the University of Bradford in the UK. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. Raffaello, is the relationship between Russia and China being put to its greatest test since the collapse of the Soviet Union? And is the conflict in Ukraine becoming a major challenge for China?
I think it's probably a bit exaggerated to say this is the greatest challenge to the relationship since the end of the Cold War. I think it's a major strain, and in a way it's a big challenge for the world. Is it the biggest that we've had since the end of the Cold War? I think that's difficult, and it probably depends on which issues you prioritize. But I think certainly it's a major issue, but I think it's actually placing probably less of a strain than is being painted at the moment on the China-Russia relationship, mostly because the Chinese have made it abundantly clear that they are not going to walk away from their close partner and are quite happy to sort of continue to manage things as they are going forwards. They're clearly concerned by the loss of life and the humanitarian issues that are going on and have expressed concern about that. But I've seen very little evidence of them actually stepping forward to do something about this situation, either in terms of pressuring Russia or pressuring Ukraine.
So, Owen, what do you make of Chinese foreign minister calling Russia Beijing's most important strategic partner amid this crisis? Because we know Foreign Minister Wang Yi said, I quote, "No matter how perilous the international landscape, we will maintain our strategic focus and promote the development of a comprehensive China-Russia partnership in the new era." What would this new era look like?
I think the Chinese are most comfortable with their partnership with Russia when it's in a rivalry with the United States. So, in other words, they see it being China's government sees it being very useful having a close diplomatic relationship with Russia in all of the potential tensions with the United States, including obviously risks of Taiwan, but other issues too. I wouldn't over-exaggerate how close the alliance is. I think it seems very clear that Russia was not honest with China when it came to their plans to invade Ukraine. Of course, we don't know this for certain, but it looks pretty much likely that this was not something, the plans were not revealed to China. And so this will only enhance China's caution when dealing with Russia in terms of how close that alliance gets. But I do agree that on balance, China can see some advantages in having the United States obviously having to focus on Russia and Ukraine at the moment, and therefore being distracted from its focus on China.
So, Raffaello, how far is China willing to go in supporting Russia now that the clashes have escalated and we have Putin threatening to cut gas to Europe? Where does this leave China's official position?
I mean, I think the Chinese aren't particularly going to move very far on their position. I think they made it very clear they support Russia and they would probably like the situation to be resolved quickly. I think where the Chinese are probably a bit frustrated is how long this is dragging out and how much longer it will go on going forward. I think at the end of the day, any major disruption to the global economy is negative for them. Oil prices going up is negative for them. But at the same time, they probably don't feel like they're in much of a position to actually criticize and stop the Russians from doing what they're doing. So I think the critical thing here is not so much, what Russia is doing, but in the sense that the Chinese would like that the conflict and whatever happens does stay constrained within the kind of European context. And within that context, I think they're fairly comfortable with letting Russia basically do what it wants.
So, Owen, could you talk to us about the shared interests of these two countries? And how do you think, how has NATO's expansion towards the East united Russia and China? And did it give maybe the most needed excuse for both?
Thanks. I mean, I think this is a strategic alliance in the sense that they guess there's going to be a long-term rivalry with the United States. But I think China is playing a longer game than Russia. So, for example, after the annexation of Crimea and so on, Russia was extremely gave a very high priority to doing gas and energy deals with China, and China got an extremely good deal. And so I think this essentially probably weakens Russia's position in relation to China. And so China will be able to extract pretty good economic and other concessions from this, I think, over the period. In terms of NATO expansion, I think this NATO expansion issue, in a sense, is a bit of a distraction. It's one of those well-worn narratives that could explain a lot of what went on in the 2000s, I think. But ever since Russia's annexation of Crimea, that was enough to make it very clear that NATO was never going to expand to Ukraine, because NATO won't accept members with pre-existing conflicts. So I think in this context, it's more that NATO's the spread of Western influence in Eastern Europe is more symbolic of the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed, and so in a sense this is more a sense of grievance about from Putin to do with reconstructing their sphere of influence than it is specifically about NATO expansion.
So, Raffaello, to which extent do both countries need one another in order to confront the US and its allies, both in Europe and in the Asia Pacific? And do you believe that Beijing thinks that it could become the next target if Russia somehow collapses or is severely weakened by this conflict?
I think that the two of them are at the moment very close, mostly because they both see themselves as locked in a conflict with the United States. They're both permanent members of the UN Security Council. They're both nuclear powers. They're both substantial powers on the world stage, major powers they would describe themselves as, and they are. And so as a result, knowing that you've always got a major power in your corner in a conflict against the, mighty United States is something that they're both very keen to do, and will continue to sort of support each other as a result of that. I think the point I would try to pick up a bit on the last question as well, if I may, because I think one interesting thing to look at within this context is to think about this current events in Ukraine on a timeline, and that timeline has two other events on it. One is 2014 and the Russian annexation of Crimea, and before that, in 2008, the Russian-led invasion of Georgia and the recognition of the breakaway republics of South Ossetia and Abkhazia.
Yes.
And I think what's interesting to look at is Chinese reaction to each of those events. And if you look at the reactions in 2008, they were frankly appalled. And you actually saw the Chinese make some diplomatic statements that were really quite surprising for them about their concern about what the Russians were doing, about recognizing, small republics with, ethnic communities that were not there. The Chinese are fearful that someone's going to do this to them. They've got lots of sort of ethnic communities and places near borders that they worry someone might sort of interfere with. So that's always been a major concern. So in 2008, you saw them actively going out diplomatically and trying to lobby against what the Russians were doing and pushing back on it. If you then cut to 2014, when the Russians essentially did the same thing in Ukraine with Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk, you see the Chinese basically stayed fairly passive. They didn't condemn, but they didn't really come out and loudly praise. And if we then look at what's happening today in Ukraine, where they're not so much praising what the Russians are doing, but they're definitely taking the Russian line.
Yes.
And Wang Yi, notwithstanding all the pressure that they're coming under, he still continues to repeat the line that this is really about NATO expansion. This is all about the United States. So the trajectory I would look at is, I would say, look at that. You start back in 2008, where you can see the Chinese really quite concerned, and you look at today when they seem willing to repeat essentially Kremlin talking points. And so I think the critical element that's changed there is not the Russia-China relationship, which has got closer in all that time. But it's really their sense of joint confrontation with the United States, which is clearly the key strategic issue that they both see themselves focused on. And so as long as that's there, I don't think you're going to see either one of them actively doing something to undermine the other one's interests or go against him.
Owen, would you agree with Raffaello? I mean, how long can China keep its cautious stance on the Ukraine crisis?
Yeah, I take the same position. I think the Chinese, I mean, one of the key things is obviously President Xi is pursuing a much more assertive Chinese foreign policy than was previously. And of course, that coincides with, his taking over power and asserting his new policy sort of is roughly in line with the Crimea annexation. So I do think that one of the elements of this, in addition to everything that's been said so far, is of course Taiwan and South China Seas issues. And so there is a strong element of assertiveness. On the other hand, China has traditionally been a much more cautious power than Putin on the deployment of military force. But I do think that there is a sort of sense of additional pressure and attention on whether or not there are risks. So I see that also playing into China's relationship with Russia. That if a crisis blows up and they end up in military conflict with Taiwan, they would be expecting Russia to back them up. And I'm not saying that that's likely, but I am saying it's much more likely now than it was, say, 7 or 8 years ago. And so I think that plays the thing too.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.